Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. I am really excited to be with you here today. I get to have someone on the show who I've been reading and listening to a lot. In fact, when I got to interact with him pre-show, it was pretty funny to hear his voice and see his face because I've been, kind of imbibing so much of his content over the last year. So his name is Aaron Renn, and before I kind of introduce him and let him introduce himself, just a couple of reflections I've had with his content. He did a great episode on masculinity, and I shared it with my wife because some of the stuff he says is just so dead on in terms of Christianity, masculinity. I was listening to one episode where he talked about how as Christian men we're often taught kind of being a nice guy, being a servant leader, and that's going to get you what you want. And it kind of leads to a lot of doormat personalities. And that is exactly my story. He was telling my story, and it can lead to a lot of resentment for a lot of men when they realize, man, that's not how, one, God designed the world to work, and two, that's just not how the world works because God designed it that way. So there was that one, and then even this latest episode this week, it was really good to hear him talk about in-groups and out-groups and kind of the opportunities you have as someone who's an insider of an organization versus an outsider of an organization to reform, to speak into, when you have to hold your tongue, when you get to speak out. I mean, really great insights from Aaron Renn. So I'm really excited to have him on the show. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
For sure. One of the questions I always start out with, just so people can get to know you better, and it's a question with all the content you produce, I've either failed to read or failed to appreciate when you've said it, but I'd love to hear more about your background and, kind of where I know you were a consultant, did that thing, and now you're producing a lot of content. So kind of what's your story?
Yeah, so my career sort of involves three phases. I started off as a sort of technology and management consultant with a very large consulting company there. So I did about 15 years, advising companies on technology and helping them to deploy it. And then I did a career pivot into essentially urban policy. So it's very complex how I got there, but essentially I started writing about state and local policy, particularly urban policy in Midwestern Rust Belt cities. So that became a very big topic after the election of Donald Trump. People start looking at those areas, but I was kind of early to that, and ended up working for a conservative think tank in New York for several years there, and then sort of kind of done another pivot talking about call it Christian men's issues, but really men's issues as just an entry point into how the church in America needs to change, to adapt to changing times. So that's sort of been my career arc. I see the world through the lens of a consultant. I really feel like our professional heritage shapes a lot about how we see the world. I think a lot of the guests on your show are people who come from an academic theology background, and they bring that lens. And that's a great lens. I think one of the reasons that people have followed me and have really liked my writing, both in urban policy and in the Christian space, is precisely because I have a different lens that lets people see things in a slightly different way. I never tell people I have the answer. I just want to equip people with tools, frameworks, information that they can use to help make sense out of the world. And I would say supplement it for sure with academic perspectives, pastoral perspectives, many others. But that's the way I look at the world. And then, I grew up a little bit more. I grew up in rural Southern Indiana. I grew up about 4 miles outside of a town of 29 people, and then moved to Chicago. So I love cities like only somebody from a town of 29 people can. That's how I really got interested in urban policy. Moving to Chicago was very transformational for me. And so, my journey has been from kind of rural to urban, and now back to, again, urban again, but I'm in Indianapolis, not New York City anymore.
That's great. That's really helpful for me to understand. I experienced the same thing with my background in construction, growing up on a job site with my dad as a subcontractor and putting in sprinklers and then going to work for GCs. And it shapes my sermons. It even shapes how I think about G and renovations, all that kind of stuff. Those terminology, that framework for thinking comes up over and over again. One of the things that you have been really helpful on is, like you mentioned, giving people tools to think about the world. And so you wrote an article, I can't remember when, And the edition I got forwarded to me looked like it was a PDF out of a Gmail at the
Yeah.
time, but now you've really honed in of the Masculinist and the Aaron Renn podcast and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm sharing this with board members, elders, other pastors, and it's the way I remember it is just the positive, neutral, negative world framework. So I've been sharing this with everyone, but for a lot of people I know, either linked or seen another article, because I send out a lot to my friends, can be a bit prohibitive. And so one of the reasons I wanted to get you on the podcast is to share that framework on my podcast with people who listen. So could you walk me through the positive, neutral, negative world framework that you either you coined or riffed off of, or what was that about?
Yeah, I think everybody gets that something has changed about the world in the way that the world perceives the church. So I originally developed this framework back, I published it in 2017, but I actually came up with it probably in 2014. And basically, what I realized, man, the world, we're on the cusp of a major change. And so, what I call the three worlds are three separate eras that define three different ways society has viewed Christianity or treated Christianity. And again, I call it the positive, neutral, negative. So, in the positive world, which I say is prior to 1994, Christianity was viewed positively. It had a sort of normative status in society. If you were known as a good church going man, that made people like you better. They thought you were more trustworthy. They thought you were an upstanding citizen in society. So there was some positivity there. And the moral norms of society still largely reflected Christian moral norms. Then you enter into this neutral world. And again, the story arc here is that Christianity essentially reached its peak in terms of church attendance in the 50s. That was the highest decade ever for church attendance in America. And then Christianity slowly eroded, really starting in the 60s with, the upheavals, the sexual revolution. And so Christianity's status was kind of eroding. And around 1994, we crossed a threshold into which Christianity is no longer seen positively, but it's not seen negatively either. It's sort of a socially neutral attribute. I say it's like, a personal affectation or hobby. It's like, oh, you're a Christian? I'm a vegan. Let's talk, right? These sort of things. And so I say this, again, lasted from around 1994 to 2014. Again, don't get hung up on the dates. It's sort of treat this as a heuristic, right? This is not some, objective pattern of reality. It's just a tool. But then after 2014, we really went through another threshold. And essentially, we're now in a negative world in which Christianity is viewed negatively by society, certainly elite society, upper middle class society. And to be known as a sort of traditional Bible believing church going Christian is actually going to hurt you socially in a lot of domains today in a way that it used to not to. And I think at this point, Christian moral norms have been expressly repudiated. And in fact, Christianity today is essentially viewed as a threat to the new social order and the new public morality, right? In essence, Christianity is seen as subverting the public good in some way. And this is a very new place for Christianity, something that we have not had experience with in the United States ever, really, certainly not on our lifetime. So the ground is sort of shifted under our feet, and we're still trying to figure out how to adapt to it.
Yeah, it's a really helpful framework, like you said. It reminds me of something I heard a lot about, planting in a liberal town like Boulder. We like to compare the United States to Europe in a lot of ways, and there are some comparable examples. And so for a lot of us in more liberal contexts, we were taught like we should do mission like they do mission in Europe, and that's an idea, and you can try that. But one of the questions I always ask is how's that going? Is the church making great inroads and advancement? And there's signs of some, but in terms of culture change, I don't know if we should base our missional engagement off of how Europe's going. And so I found your framework to be a really helpful thing. Was there something that you experienced in your life or that you saw? You talked about how the kind of time was a bit relative, but was there something that you were seeing that kind of made you pick up on this framework?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. The triggering thought, I saw this series of short films that was produced by a friend of mine who was doing work at the Acton Institute at the time. It was called For the Life of the World. There's a famous book by an Orthodox theologian by that title, and he drew on that and other things. And it was essentially vignettes about different parts of modern society. And I went and looked at it. I saw a screening of it at Indiana Wesleyan University. And I'm like, man, that is a great film. They did a great job with that. But yet, in the back of my mind, something said, that was the film for 5 years ago, right? Not the film for today. And I just went home and I just started making bullet points on my computer. And that was sort of the genesis of the framework. But really, I had gone through a period of refactoring in my life. I had, I don't have time to go into it, but basically I went through essentially a 3-year, plus desert period in which I really started rethinking a lot of what I thought that I knew. Caused me to question a lot. A lot of things that I just took in and just assumed, the servant leader concept, for example. Hey, is that really true? And so I applied a much more critical lens to the world, and that probably played a role in me starting to rethink society.
Yeah, I've been in a season of that. I'm a bit late to the party, maybe, but I think with COVID and other racial tensions in the United States, and then talking with various pastors and leaders, I've been in this season where I'm just being like, man, like what have I assumed to be true, and what maybe should I have picked up on sooner? And so that's why I really appreciate your framework. One of the things that I think was helpful for me was then you identified some characters along the way in the positive, neutral, negative world spaces that were really effective during those times. And a lot of times as Christians, in any institution, you get these people that were effective at that time, and then they kind of outlive their effectiveness, whether it's church or business or anything like that. Who are some of the people that you named during those times that were really kind of emblematic of those worlds in the church?
Sure. So one of the things that I said was each of these worlds had a sort of characteristic ministry strategy that became big during that. So essentially, as the status of Christianity was kind of declining in the 70s, there was an emergence of really two different groups. One is what we now call the religious right, the culture warriors, right? That was the culture war period. And that was people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson that took evangelicals from the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, essentially became the most reliable, solid Republican voting bloc, and really fought culture, wanted to fight the culture. It's like we sense that we sense that things are eroding around us, and our answer is we're going to fight back. We're going to fight it. A second stream was the seeker sensitivity movement. And the development of essentially kind of non-denominational megachurches in the suburbs. And, you could think of people like Rick Warren in Saddleback Church out in Orange County, or Bill Hybels in Willow Creek Church in suburban, Chicago. And these people weren't culture warriors. In a sense, I say they're sort of a neutral world prototype, but, kind of what they did was, hey, we see that people are not coming to church like they used to. How do we adapt so that people will want to come to church? And so, in essence, the very term seeker sensitive is predicated on an underlying friendliness to Christianity. The idea is there's a lot of people out there seeking. And if we create this new environment that's contextualized to today's suburban lifestyle, that's less about all these, fuddy-duddy denominational distinctives and legacy practices, and, with modern music, modern auditoriums, et cetera, people will come. And that was very, very, very successful. And still, in many ways, that's the evangelical mainstream today. And then in the neutral world, there was another group of people that really became, I would say, very big. And that's what I call the cultural engagement strategy. The cultural engagement strategy. And the idea is, rather than fighting with the emerging secular culture, let's engage with it. We think Christianity has something to say. And we don't have to fear a pluralistic public square in which Christianity is just one of many. Let's sit down. Let's have a conversation. Let's engage. And so, there's a lot of people you could put in this. I use the example of Tim Keller and Redeemer Presbyterian Church. He really was kind of the neutral world, practitioner par excellence. and just, very high caliber individual overall, to be quite honest. And so, he came in the 90s, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people were saved at Redeemer. And, at one point on, an average Sunday, like half the people coming to church there were non-Christians. So it was very effective in both. I think this is unique, very effective both in sort of equipping Christians to live in the world, but also in reaching the unsaved in, Manhattan. And so I think, that was kind of another model that was very successful. It was more urban. I tie this a lot to the urban resurgence, fits in with my kind of urban studies.
Yeah.
In essence, one reason I picked 1994 is that's the year Rudy Giuliani became mayor of New York City. And really the crime collapsed, and it became a different place. So a lot of evangelical young people were coming to the cities anyway after they graduated from college, and so it really changed the landscape of America in profound ways. The culture warrior people from places like Lynchburg, Virginia Beach, Baton Rouge, they were kind of from cultural backwaters. The cultural engagers are much more in the cultural center, and I think they are also under a lot of pressures that people don't appreciate, because of their presence in places like New York or Washington, D.C. In parts of the country, it's still in many ways the positive world. Where I grew up, in rural Southern Indiana, you could be an extremely conservative Christian, and yeah, people are going to like that. So there are still some places where kind of the positive world still exists. But you go into these big cities is where the negative, kind of where I call the negative world now is bearing down. But it was just a very different dynamic, and so they were much more urban, I would say, and kind of global city in their orientation there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like to use the illustration of my wife is from a small town. Her dad and her family's been farming there for generations. And I went back to visit. And because I'm a curious person and I grew up in a big city, anytime they would do anything related to the farm, I would just kind of volunteer to like go watch, participate, ask questions. Well, they had a meeting for Farm Bureau, and it was in they had the meeting in a church. So first of all, it's a neutral, secular, so to speak, organization meeting in a First Baptist church. And then I show up because I'm just curious. And then they asked me to pray for the meeting to start it off. And so that was seen as morally acceptable, morally good, honorable. And it made me reflect on my own context in Boulder and kind of how that would never be acceptable in our town. That would just be seen as very actually bad if a pastor was invited to kick off a meeting for a secular organization. That would be very bad news. And that really helped me kind of frame it. If somebody's wondering, how do I identify markers? Because you said, there's still some parts, whether you call it the heartland or whatever, there's still some places where positive world kind of Christianity exists. How would somebody do kind of a assessment of their own life about their own context? And maybe what are some indicators that they're living in a more negative world or a neutral world?
Yeah, some of it's geographic, some of it is culture class related. So people like Robert Putnam or Charles Murray have written these books talking about how essentially the top 20% of people in America by income and education are by and large doing quite well. They are, highly functional, successful in their careers, get married, have stable marriages. And people who are sort of in the bottom 80% are really struggling to build a life. Tremendous sort of relational instability, serial boyfriends, girlfriends, lots of divorce, multi-partner fertility, struggling economically. This is the people who are taking the opioids, right? And having all of that. And so if you are in essentially an upper middle class milieu, which could be in sort of an urban setting or could be in a suburban setting, if you work for a major corporation or major institution like a university, then you are living probably more in a negative world environment, regardless of where you are. Whereas if you're in a lower social class environment, you're capable of, still living in kind of different settings. So when I lived in Chicago, I attended a church there that happened to be sort of a blue collar church. I think it was plurality Hispanic. It was multi-site. And so, our location was not majority Hispanic, but like the kind of the flagship location was majority Hispanic. They had a lot of Spanish language services. And so when you're sort of in that blue collar world, even in Chicago, you know, the the character is just different, and you can say and do a lot of things that are going to seem a little out of place. You know, if you were going to a place that a church that predominantly attracted high income professionals, they're just going to experience two different worlds in the city. And it's like, you know, a place like New York City, there are tons of Christians in New York. You know, Tony Carnes, who runs the great site, A Journey Through New York City Religions, he calls New York the first post-secular city because there are so many religious groups, but especially Christians, especially out in like the outer boroughs. You know, there are a lot of Christians, but they're less part of this, upper class and upper middle class milieu of Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn. And that, so I think even within a place like New York City, a place like Chicago, you've got sort of different environments. Boulder, I'm not as familiar with, but it's probably more uniformly, negative world just because it's, very highly educated, college town, overwhelmingly white, et cetera.
Yeah, and that makes it really challenging thinking about your framework because when we came in and started the kind of ethos that we wanted to embody was Keller, which
Right.
is great. You know, we still endorse City Church. It's one. I always joked that if you wanted to know more about our church, just look at our playbook called City Church or our Center Church, because it really informed our
Center
ministry. But what
Church,
I
yeah, Center Church is Keller's best book, in my opinion. It's really excellent.
Yeah, it's so great. It's so helpful. And also, I'm having trouble transitioning my own kind of viewpoint into that negative world space because, some you can overcorrect, correct, or you can try some things out, and I think some people perceive it as culture warrior mentality. But there's a book, and I can't remember what it's called, where it talks about resiliency and kind of organizations that can kind of bounce back, where they're not fragile, like anti-fragile.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what it's called, anti-fragile, and that's kind of church we want to embody. But we're still trying to figure that out. And one of the ways we're trying to figure that out is we're trying to see who's doing it well. Who are the
Mhm.
people that are living out kind of the negative world ethos well, rather than just kind of leaning on the positive, or I'm sorry, neutral world framework where it's like we'll just kind of
Mhm.
coexist and cultural engagement, and we're like that's really not being that effective at making biblical disciples that know the Bible, that know the truth, and that can go into these workplaces where they're being forced to sit through trainings and
Right.
indoctrination sessions, and they can't stand on their own 2 feet. So who would you say is doing the negative world tactics well?
That's a great question. One of the things that I noted back in 2017 in that original piece is the real strategic work that had been done in the negative world space. The only person who was really thinking about it was Rod Dreher with his book, The Benedict Option. Now, Dreher is Eastern Orthodox, formerly Catholic. He basically admits he doesn't know anything about evangelicalism. In fact, he just said in one of his newsletters that he attended his first evangelical service ever, like a couple weeks ago. He really didn't relate well to the cultural sensibilities of evangelicals. I don't think naming your book after a Catholic, the founder of Catholic monasticism, probably didn't play well in a lot of Protestant circles. But nevertheless, the evangelicals basically rejected it. I mean, I remember that Christianity Today commissioned 4 people to give their takes. And I think basically all of them were negative, if I recall. You have to look it up for sure, but like it basically we don't want to think this way. And so, I see the Benedict option, this idea of a Benedict option community as something that is an attempt to come up with what would a strategy look like in the negative world. And I don't think that it's the only possible strategy. I think, the world is very diverse. I mean, America is very diverse in terms of it's ethnically diverse, diverse number of states, geographies, cultural histories. Not everything is exactly the same. So your strategy in a major urban center is going to look very different from, a strategy in the in the center of a country or kind of in a rural area. And so, to be quite candid, from a Protestant perspective, I don't see great examples of people really taking a negative world approach. Thinking of it from the ground up. There's a guy by the name of Michael Foster who's trying to do that in Batavia, Ohio, with the church plant there. But the people who are sort of doing things that are interesting in this space are people who are sort of creating Benedict option like communities. So the SSPX Catholic community in St. Mary's, Kansas is an example of that. Coeur d'Alene, Idaho has a very strong trad Catholic component there that they're trying to build it. And I think in the Protestant world, what Doug Wilson and Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho has done embodies a lot of Benedict option principles. I always say I classify them as positive world. I do not classify them as negative world because I think they operate very much in a culture war mindset. Their little kind of network that they run, Fight, Laugh, Feast. Their very identity, right? Fight. We fight with people. That's a culture war mindset. But nevertheless, I think if you look at what they have done, they have built a lot of institutions and done a lot of strategic things to make them very hard to kill in a deep blue. They're the college town. They're the Boulder, Colorado of Idaho. I mean, when I thought Moscow, Idaho, like, what the heck? Why would I want to go to Idaho? It's like some sovereign citizen compound out there. This is irrelevant. But it's actually the college town. It's the flagship University of Idaho. The University of Idaho is there. And it's very close to Pullman, Washington, where Washington State is, which is, Pac-12 school. It's a big school. So, they've built something there that despite, enormous, hate directed their way, has been, remarkably resilient. And in part, it is because of a lot of these kind of strategic, actions that they took. And whether they would describe it in this way, I think they've done a lot that people can learn from, quite apart from whether you agree with anything Doug Wilson does theologically or whether you agree with their culture war approach or anything of that nature. I think you can look at their model. How did they create such a beachhead in such a blue city and stir up so much trouble without getting crushed? There's some lessons to learn there.
Yeah, there are for sure. Yeah, it's a very curious example of how to engage in those kind of spaces. It's kind of a play on words off the Benedict option. I've seen it thrown around called the Boniface option, where the idea was, I believe he was a pope or a saint who went into Germanic towns and would chop down the idols of those tribes. And it's kind of someone's tongue in cheek on how should we engage the world now. And I guess that's part of my thinking that I'm chewing on a lot is how do I maintain kind of this cultural engagement in the best way possible where I can welcome people in and we can have robust dialogue and kind of embody the best of what liberalism should be, and yet also have that ability to also kind of throw some punches around and be willing to fight. That's what I think was missing from the cultural engagement piece, because I am someone who, like yourself, comes from a consultant background. One of the things I'm wondering is public perception of what they're doing in Idaho is pretty negative right now. They've got Vice coming out with kind of a hit piece on them and that kind of thing, and so it's
basically the same hit piece that's been written over and over and over. It's just more and more kind of mainstream people. Like the Guardian just did one on them, and,
and so I guess is part of living in the negative world just embracing the hate? Is it just kind of going like, hey, like we're going to be perceived negatively, why don't we just kind of take it and use it, kind of like a business would take the worst Yelp review and put it on a doormat in front of their business. I've seen some people do that almost as like a badge of honor. Like, look how hated we are. Is that just kind of what Christians need to embrace?
I don't take that approach that you should crave being hated. Back in the early church when people were being martyred, you had to be prepared that, the Christian faith might cost you your life, but it was frowned upon for people to seek martyrdom. And so in my view, I don't think we need to charge a machine gun nest, as I like to say. I don't think we need to walk in front of a freight train. I think we need to be much shrewder about how we operate. So I'm not one who thinks that we should become, So one of the things about the Idaho guys is they sort of have become anti-fragile. So one of the things that when you're anti-fragile, when the hate comes, it sort of builds up your brand, right?
Right.
In a sense, it sends a lot of eyeballs your way. And I'm not saying that's their conscious strategy, but they profit from anti-fragility. Donald Trump had that anti-fragility as well. Most people are not anti-fragile. Most people cannot survive a bad newspaper article, right? And so unless you have become anti-fragile, then you can't leverage that strategy. And so one of the things I would say is working towards anti-fragility is one of the things we should be doing to become more resilient or anti-fragile in the way that we structure our lives. And that's a very complicated topic. Probably can't get to on this podcast, but that's one way I would look at it. But that doesn't mean you have to you have to necessarily crave the hate. You have to be prepared though. It might come your way despite everything that you do to avoid it, and then you got to decide what you're going to do. But I don't think we need to court hate, invite, please hate me. In a sense, the culture war people sort of did that because again it was an anti-fragile model. If the New York Times wrote a hit piece on Pat Robertson, he would get on the 700 Club and start doing fundraising off of it. Right, that gives you opportunities to do things, but I don't know that that's the model there. Yeah, I do think cultural engagement. Not everybody in the cultural engagement world is like this, but Tim Keller was very influential. Tim Keller is a transformationalist, and in essence, that's a post-millennial vision. So I don't know. I don't know if Keller would officially say I'm a post-millennialist, but if you listen to him talk about cultural transformation and his gospel movements in the city and what he's working for, it is a transformationalist vision that is kind of de facto post-millennialist. Doug Wilson is explicitly post-millennialist. This Boniface Option is very explicitly post-millennialist. It's like, we're going to transform the whole culture. And, I'm not a post-millennialist. And I'm more of there's a nothing new under the sun kind of guy. Things come and things go. And not to say that we shouldn't try to build the kingdom where we are, but I don't think that transforming a culture of the United States or even of Boulder, Colorado is a realistic goal. I think more about think about what it means to live as one of the Copts in Egypt. The Copts are a significant minority population, like 10 to 15% of Egypt's population. And how do they live? They are kind of second-class citizens. They're not trying to culturally transform Egypt because they're in a place where they just simply can't do that. Now that doesn't mean you couldn't say, well, they should be doing this, they should be doing that. Maybe they should. And I'm not saying our situation is completely analogous to that, but essentially, we are now a religious minority in a country where the majority faith, if you will, it really is a religion, a secular religion holds sway. And I don't think the season, if you look at Ecclesiastic, right, there's a time for everything. I don't think that we're in a time of cultural transformation for the church. I think one of the things that we need to be doing is we essentially outsourced much of Christianity and Christian formation to the culture, right? The idea that the moral structures of our society were essentially the moral structures of Christianity to a great extent, and therefore being in the world, you sort of got inculcated even in school, like in some of the Christian moral values. We certainly don't do that today. So we have to become much less reliant on outside people to do things for us. For example, I really feel the evangelical church outsourced too much of their socio-political thinking to the conservative movement. Political conservatives have defined way too much about how evangelicals think about the world politically. And, that's been very harmful. And frankly, evangelicals have gotten nothing for being the most loyal Republican voting bloc. And so I think there's a lot of things that need to be, rethought in that. And again, it's a time where there's not necessarily an obvious strategy out there. It's like, oh, you do this, So I do think, some anti-fragility, trying to become, less fragile at a minimum, thinking about things like Benedict Option, which gets at this idea of you have to have a stronger community that is more internally resourced versus externally resourced. Yeah, I think these are some of the things we need to be thinking about. And there should be a kind of diversity of ideas out there about what to do.
One of the things with being anti-fragile is that I haven't read the book yet, and so I need to pick it up. But if you could
It's a
just
great
kind
book. I mean, Taleb is profoundly insightful about the world, I think, in ways that are incredibly favorable to Christianity. You could definitely read Fooled by Randomness and Anti-Fragile, and it's almost a statistical validation of some of the things that we would say. For example, he would say a lot of the world is random. A lot of the outcomes in life are random chance. And these black swan events, these rare events, often have a dominant, outsized influence on outcomes. I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, wow, that sort of sounds like the sovereignty of God, randomness, sovereignty of God, and these black swan ideas, and the idea that something that you hadn't even considered, that you had never even thought about, is out there that could happen means, there's room for God to show up, uh, no matter what our situation looks like. I think about that a lot. Like one of the things that happened in my desert season is as I was coming to the end of it, I really felt, and not of the sense that God's literally talking to me. All right, I'm just putting a lens on this event. It's almost like, okay, now Aaron, let me show you the answers to questions you did not even know you were supposed to be asking. Okay. And so it's like, whoa. I mean, like I didn't even possibly contemplate that as and so I think there's so much we don't know. I think, we look at the negative world and I have all my frameworks and things to go, but what I see is just this much, right?
Right.
The world and God they're so much bigger. And so there's always room for God to show up. And so there's so much in Taleb that I really recommend it.
That's great. And then if there's one takeaway from Anti-Fragile that someone listening to this podcast or I could take away that you think would be helpful, what would be a useful way that people could take something from Anti-Fragile and kind of live differently?
Oh, well, I think one of his key concepts is what he calls the barbell. And that is you're better off with a strategy that involves two extremes rather than concentrating in the middle. So he might say you're better off reading some trashy romance novels and high art literature on the one hand versus a bunch of middle brow would be an example. And so I think about the lower end of the barbell first. How do we de-risk our lives? One, we de-risk it by spending less money, saving more money, avoiding debt, things of that nature. Is there a way to create a career that isn't dependent on one of these structurally, unfriendly institutions? Maybe, maybe it's better to be, an HVAC contractor than it is to work for the pharmaceutical company in your town. You can still make money doing other things. Maybe you should start a business that is not dependent on these things. There's a lot you can think about there, but how do you reduce your exposure, I think, to the world, and then where are the risks that you want to take at kind of the other end of the barbell? So I think, a lot of it's very simple. It would be like Dave Ramsey: stay out of debt. Don't limit your consumerism, all of that sort of stuff. Et cetera.
That's great. Well, I want to make sure to point people to the right place to get more of your content. Obviously, the part of the reason I love your content is you don't mind upsetting people with some of the things you say, including like I think you even said that in one of your podcasts. It's like if you're not upsetting 20% of your audience at any given time, you're probably not producing good content. And so I really appreciate that about your content. But I know you have The Masculinist. Is that a blog, website? What is it? Where can people find that?
So go to themasculinist.com. The most important thing you need to do there is sign up for my newsletter. I have a flagship monthly newsletter that gives in-depth commentary, and this is where the positive, neutral, negative world framework originally was there. All the back issues are there. There's one on Taleb's called Anti-Fragile Church, issue number 14.
Perfect.
So look that up. It's right next to the one on positive, neutral, negative world. So I wrote about that, and then that'll link you to all my other content. There's a podcast and a YouTube show, and I do blogging there. I'm going to be making a few changes, but that's where you can find everything. The central HQ for right now.
That's great. And you've got the Aaron Renn, I think it's Aaron Renn Show podcast, right?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, podcast. It's all linked right there. So
okay, perfect.
You'll find it. Yes, subscribe to the podcast, and it's insights again. Not every show is equally great, but I try to give people things that other people aren't. I always like to say, people don't need me to repeat the conventional wisdom. So I think some people probably have a mistaken impression of, my beliefs, that because I'm usually saying things that are sort of unusual, people think I'm much more unusual. I have a lot of beliefs that are actually quite conventional. I just don't do them. It's like the world is not who's gonna pay attention to me instead of the biggest names out there if all I am is sort of me too. Yeah, that's great. Nobody
Yeah,
wants to do that. You need to consume. I need to earn the time that people devote to reading and listening to my stuff. And the way that I do that is by giving them things that they cannot get anywhere else. There's insight and analysis, I guarantee you, that you are not going to hear anywhere else. So please check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I will drop those links in the show notes. Thanks for those of you who are listening today, watching on YouTube. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel so you can stay up to date. I know I was a bit irregular in terms of production schedule this last month. Our church is trying to buy a building, and that's a very complicated process in Boulder. So thanks for being patient with me. We'll try to get another episode up next week, but thanks for spending time with us, and we'll see you soon.